This COVID-19 thing has hurt a lot of loggers. I just want to ask our governors and us loggers in North Carolina, we're hurting right now, and we need some help.
Deep in the swamps of North Carolina, where the air hums with mosquitoes and the mud could swallow a man whole, a small crew of loggers once made reality TV feel raw, dangerous, and real. Swamp Loggers wasn't about fame or flash. It was about survival, family, and the daily grind of pulling a living from a place that tried to take it back every day with interest. For years, Bobby Goodson led his team through rising water, broken equipment, and near disasters that turned ordinary men into legends. Then, just as quickly as it began, it was gone. Fans waited, hoping the roar of the skidders and the crack of cypress would return to their screens, but they didn't get it. Now, Bobby's finally breaking his silence, and the truth behind why swamp loggers will never come back is heavier than any log they ever hauled. Join us as we wade through the secrets behind that mystery. There's a sound the swamp makes when the machines stop running, and it's not exactly silence, but something close. The hum of insects rises, the water ripples against cypress knees, and the echo of diesel engines fades into memory. It's the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it remembers everything that's been taken from it. For years, that silence was broken by the roar of Bobby Goodson's logging crew as they fought mud, rain, and rising water to carve a living from one of the harshest environments in America. Swamp Loggers wasn't just a TV show, it was a portrait of survival, sweat, and Southern grit, wrapped in the humblest package. When the Discovery Channel first aired Swamp Loggers, expectations weren't too high. How could it, when there weren't scripted arguments, fake deadlines, or even luxury backdrops? It was just Bobby, his father, his son, and a tight-knit crew of men who spent their days knee-deep in muck and machinery. Somehow, each episode captured the kind of real-life tension that didn't need editing, a weather that could ruin a week's income, and the daily fight to keep equipment running in the unforgiving swamp. When it ended, speculation filled the silence for years. But before diving into the speculations and truths of the swamp, let's take a proper look at how it all started and exactly why the fans kept tuning in from mud to mainstream. Before there were cameras, there was just the swamp, a stretch of tangled cypress and black water, where logging wasn't a hobby or a headline, it was how families survived. Bobby Goodson had been in the woods since he was a boy, learning the trade from his father and grandfather before him. Logging was in his blood, but it was never easy. Every day meant gambling with weather, equipment, and terrain that could change from solid ground to knee-deep sludge in a matter of minutes. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and unpredictable, but it was honest. That was the world swamp loggers walked into when the Discovery Channel came calling. In the mid-2000s, Discovery was redefining reality television. Shows like Deadliest Catch and Dirty Jobs were proving that audiences were hungry for something raw and real. Stories about people who did the jobs others couldn't or wouldn't. These shows celebrated blue-collar courage, and swamp loggers fit that mold perfectly. What set it apart was its heart. Where Deadliest Catch thrived on life and death tension at sea, swamp loggers found beauty in quiet resilience, in the family bonds that held through mud, machinery failures, and financial strain. The idea to film Bobby's crew started small. Local producers had heard about the Goodson operation, a family-run logging business pulling high-value timber out of the most treacherous parts of North Carolina's swampland. Bobby wasn't looking for fame. When the cameras showed up, he wasn't sure what to make of it. To him, reality TV was about drama and gimmicks, not work boots and swamp gas, but the crew promised to keep it real. No scripts, no setups, just the raw, unpredictable life of a swamp logger. He agreed, as long as they didn't interfere with the work. From the first episode, it was clear that something different was happening. Viewers weren't watching actors. They were watching real men face real risks. They saw trucks sinking into black water, loaders breaking down miles from the nearest road, and storms that could wipe out a week's income overnight. They saw him juggling it all, keeping his crew safe, meeting contracts, and staying true to his family name. What drew audiences in wasn't just the danger, but the dignity. These weren't reckless daredevils, they were craftsmen, fighting nature and time to make a living the old-fashioned way. The family dynamic became the show's heartbeat. Bobby worked alongside his father, Gene, whose calm wisdom anchored the crew, and his son, Justin, who represented the next generation of Goodson loggers. Their bond gave the show warmth and humanity. When tensions flared, which they so often did, it never felt scripted for dramatic effects. You could see the respect even in disagreement. There was love behind every argument, loyalty behind every risk. It was a family business in the truest sense. Fans connected with that honesty. They saw themselves in Bobby's grit and frustration, the endless grind of trying to keep a small business afloat in a world stacked against you. Letters and emails poured in from across the country, written by truckers, farmers, mechanics, and everyday people who knew what it meant to work until your back gave out. Swamp Loggers wasn't glamorous, but it was authentic, and that made it a hit. The ratings climbed steadily, and by its second season, Discovery had a surprise success on its hands. Bobby and his crew were invited to conventions, interviewed on radio shows, and recognized in towns they'd never been to. Still, despite all the attention, fame never really did change the swamp. The crew still had to show up before dawn, fix broken hydraulics with frozen fingers, and wade through waist-deep mud to earn their pay. The cameras didn't make the job easier. If anything, they made it harder. Still, the show carried a quiet pride. For once, the world was seeing what it really took to make a living off the land. In an era when reality TV was full of luxury mansions and celebrity meltdowns, Swamp Loggers reminded people that dignity could still be found in dirty hands and honest work. It wasn't about chasing money or fame. It was about survival. For once, survival had never looked more real to folks living in comfort. As the seasons went on, Swamp Loggers evolved into something more than entertainment. It became a record of an endangered way of life. The logging industry was changing fast, with new environmental restrictions, market fluctuations, and corporate competition squeezing out small, independent crews. Bobby's operation wasn't just battling the swamp, it was battling extinction. Viewers could feel that struggle in every episode, in every broken chain, and every prayer before the next load. By the time Swamp Loggers reached its peak, it had carved out a loyal audience who saw him and his crew as heroes, not the kind that wore capes, but the kind that kept America running without asking for applause. The swamp became a symbol of resilience. The mud, the danger, and the sweat all told a story bigger than TV ratings, a story about pride in work and the people who refuse to give up when everything around them says to quit. What no one realized then was that behind the success, behind the fame, and the newfound recognition, something was quietly starting to shift. The pressure of production, the long hours, and the strain of keeping the operation running under the spotlight were beginning to take their toll. The cameras captured the triumphs, but they couldn't show what was happening beneath the surface, the cracks beginning to form under the weight of it all, the start of change and the price of reality. For all its authenticity, Swamp Loggers came at a cost that few outside the crew ever saw. The cameras captured the mud, the breakdowns, and the triumphs, but they couldn't capture what those moments did to the people living them. Behind the laughter, the teasing, and Bobby's steady leadership, the reality of running a logging operation under constant public scrutiny was far heavier than any load they pulled out of the swamp. Every morning still began the same, right before sunrise, before coffee, and before the sound crew arrived. He would be out in the yard, checking machines, gauging the weather, and talking strategy with his father, Gene. The difference now was the added pressure of production. Where once he worried only about hauling timber, he now had to think about storylines, camera angles, and filming schedules. Logging is a business built on adaptability. When the ground's too wet, you move. When a truck breaks, you improvise. Television, on the other hand, runs on structure. Discovery needed episodes, not excuses. That tension between the chaos of real life and the order of production wore on everyone. The crew wasn't made up of actors. They were loggers, plain and simple. They were used to cussing when things went wrong, to walking off when tempers flared, to working through pain because there wasn't another choice. Suddenly, there were microphones clipped to their shirts and cameramen tracking every move. A dropped chain, a broken loader, or a bad day could be replayed 100 times in editing. That kind of scrutiny changed things. The swamp was hard enough without having to perform it for millions of viewers. Bobby tried to shield his team from the pressure. He insisted the show remain as real as possible with no fake drama and definitely no scripted fights. But television has its own demands, and sometimes the simplest story needed retelling or repeating to make sense for an audience that had never seen a logging job before. There were reshoots when equipment failed or when audio didn't pick up over the roar of diesel engines. It wasn't anyone's fault, but the rhythm of their work was broken. What once was instinctive started becoming staged. Not exactly fake, but distinctly forced. The physical toll was another story altogether. Logging in a swamp means constant danger from unstable terrain to sinking trucks, heavy machinery, and unpredictable weather. Add cameras, extra vehicles, and crew members standing just a few feet away, and it became exponentially more complicated. Every job carried risk, but now he wasn't just responsible for his own men. He was responsible for an entire film crew, people who didn't always understand the swamp's moods or its dangers. More than once, filming had to stop because of close calls or near disasters. His biggest fear wasn't losing money, it was losing someone he cared about. Off camera, the business was suffering under its own kind of weight. Timber prices fluctuated, fuel costs soared, and production delays could halt work for days. When the cameras left, the bills didn't. Bobby was still running a company with payroll to meet and machinery to maintain. Logging doesn't pause for fame. The equipment still broke down, the weather still ruined good weeks, and the pressure to deliver timber contracts never eased. Fame didn't put food on the table, work did. Then came the emotional fatigue. Fame had a way of changing even small things. Strangers showed up at the yard, hoping to meet the crew or take photos. Calls came in from people asking for money, jobs, or advice. He wasn't a celebrity by choice, but the spotlight found him anyway. He was proud of what the show represented, but there were times he longed for the quiet days when his only audience was the swamp. The cameras didn't capture the sleepless nights spent balancing the books, the arguments over schedules, or the weight of being everyone's anchor when exhaustion set in. The crew felt it too. Some loved the attention, especially being recognized in town or hearing from fans who appreciated their work. Others found it overwhelming. A few struggled with the idea that their mistakes, once private, were now replayed on national television. Logging is a job built on pride and precision, and when that pride takes a public hit, it stings. What viewers saw as entertainment, the crew sometimes felt as exposure. Even the family dynamic, the emotional core of swamp loggers, wasn't immune. Working with family is hard enough. Working with family while millions watch every disagreement is something else entirely. Bobby and his father shared a deep respect, but they also shared the same stubborn streak. They clashed at times over safety, money, and methods. On camera, those moments made for compelling television. Off camera, they lingered longer than they should have. Bobby's son, Justin, bore the added weight of expectations, not just from his father, but from fans who saw him as the next generation of Goodson grit. That kind of pressure at a young age was heavy, even when handled with grace. Through it all, he tried to keep his perspective. He often said the cameras were just visitors. The swamp, the crew, and the work were what mattered most. Still, even he couldn't deny the fatigue that came from living life under a lens. By the time the later seasons rolled around, you could see it in his face. The long hours, the frustration, the quiet moments where he'd stare out across the swamp like he was listening to something only he could hear. Maybe it was the whisper of the water, or maybe it was a man realizing that the thing he'd built, the thing that made him famous, was also quietly wearing him down. Swamp loggers had brought pride and purpose to a forgotten trade. It showed America what real work looked like, but behind that truth was another one. Even the toughest men have limits, and even the strongest traditions can bend under the weight of fame. The swamp doesn't care about ratings. It doesn't care about fame. It takes what it takes, and it always leaves its mark. The day the cameras stopped rolling, there wasn't a big announcement. No farewell episode, no tearful goodbye to the fans who'd followed every muddy mile of swamp loggers. One day, the episodes stopped airing. The promos disappeared, and that was it. For a show that had built its reputation on honesty, the silence that followed was almost shocking. Viewers searched for answers. Was it canceled, or was Bobby retiring? Inside the Goodson yard, life didn't stop. It couldn't. The swamp still needed to be logged. The equipment still needed repairs, and the bills still came due. For Bobby, it was almost a relief, at least at first. The pressure of production had lifted, and for the first time in years, he could focus solely on the business that had existed long before television ever found him. The cameras were gone, but the mud, the rain, and the family business were still there waiting like an old friend who never asked questions. That quiet should have been familiar, but it came with a strange emptiness. For all the chaos that filming brought, it had also brought energy, purpose, and recognition. The crew had grown used to the rhythm of filming days, the camera trucks pulling in, the sound guys setting up, the producers walking around with clipboards and headsets. When it stopped, the yard felt different, empty, almost too quiet. Bobby once said it reminded him of the day after a hurricane, when the noise is gone, but everything feels unsettled. Fans didn't take the show's disappearance lightly. Letters poured in asking when swamp loggers would return. Social media pages lit up with speculation and theories. Some blamed Discovery for abandoning one of the few shows that represented working-class America with dignity. Others assumed the show had run its course, and that maybe he was tired, or that the swamp had finally taken too much out of him. A few even floated darker rumors of injuries, bankruptcy, and disputes with the network. None of it was true in any sensational sense. The truth, as it turned out, was far simpler. Publicly, in interviews and fan events, he thanked viewers for their support. He never badmouthed Discovery or the producers, even when he could have. That wasn't his way. Privately, though, it stung. The show had been more than a paycheck. It was a legacy. It told the story of his family, his crew, and a disappearing way of life. Seeing it end without closure felt like watching the swamp reclaim something he'd worked years to build. The crew, too, had mixed emotions. Some were glad to be done with the cameras, now free to work without retakes, without worrying about how they looked or sounded on TV. Others missed the sense of purpose that came with knowing their work meant something to people far beyond North Carolina. For them, swamp loggers had been more than a show. It had been a validation that their dangerous, dirty, and difficult jobs mattered. Without it, they went back to being invisible, the unsung workers in a world that often forgot how things got built. Financially, the end of Swamp Loggers was a hit, but not a fatal one. Contrary to what some fans believed, he didn't walk away with Hollywood riches. Most of what came from the show went back into keeping the operation afloat, repairing machines, covering downtime, and paying his men. The real money was still in the timber, and timber never paid easily. Emotionally, the loss ran deeper. The crew had become a family, not just to each other, but to millions of viewers. That connection, that shared identity, was suddenly gone. Life without cameras also meant life without control over the narrative. Online rumors swirled, videos circulated, and everyone seemed to have their own version of why Swamp Loggers ended. Some accused him of quitting. Others said Discovery forced him out. He stayed quiet through most of it, focusing on the only thing that ever made sense to him, the work. The swamp didn't care about gossip. It only cared that you showed up and did your job. Over time, the frenzy faded. Discovery filled its lineup with flashier, faster-paced shows. The era of working-man reality television gave way to survival competitions and dramatized expeditions. For a while, it felt like the world had moved on from the kind of honest storytelling Swamp Loggers represented. Then, every now and then, someone would recognize him in town at a diner, gas station, or a logging convention and shake his hand. They'd thank him for showing the world what hard work really looked like. Those moments mattered more than ratings ever could. Years passed, and he rarely spoke publicly about the show's end. The swamp changed as equipment got newer, contracts got harder to find, and the industry tightened. But some things stayed the same. He still led from the front, still treated his crew like family, and still showed up before the sun. If you didn't know better, you might think nothing had changed at all. But for those who'd watched him on TV, there was a quiet weight behind his smile, the kind that only comes from knowing how much something meant and how suddenly it was gone. Now, here is Bobby Goodson's long-awaited truth about why swamp loggers ended and why it can never come back. The hard truth and reality. For years, Bobby Goodson stayed silent. Fans asked, producers called, and rumors floated across the internet. But he kept his head down and went back to work. When he finally did speak, not to a network executive or a film crew, but to his fans directly, his answer wasn't angry, bitter, or dramatic. It was honest, and it was heartbreaking. The truth, according to him, is that the swamp never stops taking. It takes your time, your money, your body, and if you're not careful, it'll take the people you love too. It wasn't one event, one argument, or one contract dispute that ended swamp loggers. It was life. The kind of slow, grinding weight that builds up over years until even the toughest shoulders can't carry it anymore. Logging had always been hard, but filming it made it harder. The show had shone a light on a disappearing trade, but that spotlight came with a heat he could no longer stand under. He talked about exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. When you're out there every day, fighting the swamp, fighting the weather, fighting to make payroll, that's enough for any man. Then you add cameras, interviews, schedules, and people depending on you to make good TV. That's a whole other kind of pressure. At its peak, swamp loggers had turned the Goodson operation into something of a legend. But the truth was, fame didn't help the business. It complicated it. Timber buyers saw dollar signs, equipment costs rose, and when production delays hit, the financial gap fell squarely on his shoulders. He once lamented, "People think TV money fixes everything, but all it did was make the bills bigger." Then came the personal toll. Though it's not a mainstream reason for the show's end, his father, Gene, had grown older during the show's run. The long hours, the weather, the fatigue, all added up. He began to see the man who had taught him everything slowing down, struggling more with each season. We started this together, but I didn't want to end it watching my dad get hurt. For a family that had always valued work above everything, the realization hit hard. But some things were more important than another season of TV. There were other losses, too. People close to the crew faced injuries, health issues, and personal battles that the cameras never showed. The swamp had always been unforgiving, but when you mixed it with fame, it became relentless. He carried all of it, the weight of the business, the safety of his team, and the expectations of millions who saw him as the face of hard-working America. Eventually, something had to give. The industry itself was changing as well. Discovery Channel, once the home of blue-collar storytelling, began chasing faster, flashier content. The quiet, steady realism of swamp loggers didn't fit the new formula. He was offered chances to update the show, to add more drama, more conflict, less family, but he refused. That decision may have sealed the show's fate, but it kept its integrity intact. The only official confirmation provided to the public came from Bobby Goodson's wife, Lori, who posted to fans confirming that Discovery had made the decision not to renew the show's contract. She indicated that the family and crew were not given a specific reason for the cancellation, implying the decision was strictly network-driven, likely due to changing programming priorities rather than the performance of the logging company at that time. Bobby Goodson himself later stated he was surprised, but acknowledged the relief of continuing the business without the intense pressure and distraction of a production crew. These troubles didn't end with the show. They continued for quite some time more, till even the original foundation which started the show, buckled. The legacy that wouldn't sink. Logging had always been the Goodson family's backbone, the foundation that Swamp Loggers was built on. But eventually, after 10 years following the show's end, even that foundation began to buckle under the weight of rising costs and shrinking margins. Bobby fought to keep Goodson's all-terrain logging alive for years after the show ended, hoping that grit and faith would be enough to outlast the downturn. But in the end, the same economic storm that swallowed countless other small timber operations in the South finally reached him too. He had always known logging was a razor-thin business, but the numbers eventually turned against him. What used to be a steady grind became an impossible equation. Diesel prices skyrocketed, and before long, nearly 70% of every dollar he made was being poured straight back into his truck's fuel tanks. He couldn't hope to run a business like that. He said, "We were paying close to $5.50 a gallon when a few years earlier, it was $1.99. You've got millions tied up in iron, insurance, and payroll. But at the end of the month, you're still in the red." The mills weren't helping either. Rates for hauling wood stayed flat, even as costs for fuel, maintenance, and labor climbed higher every season. He tried to make it work, cutting margins, running fewer loads, working longer hours, but the math didn't lie. Every week the swamp took a little more, and every check stretched a little thinner. It wasn't about bad management, it was just bad timing. When you're working with 2 or 3% profit and everything around you doubles, you don't have a cushion, you just run out of road. Television never changed that reality. If anything, the show made it harder. People assumed Swamp Loggers brought big money, but he was quick to clarify that the fame never translated into financial relief. TV doesn't pay the diesel bill. The truth was simple and brutal. The economics of modern logging had shifted beyond what even the most determined crew could endure. Still, he never saw it as a failure, just the closing of a long, hard-fought chapter. These days, the Goodson family has shifted their focus from surviving the swamp to preserving what it taught them. He continues to stay involved in the timber community, occasionally speaking out about the challenges of modern logging and the importance of keeping blue-collar work alive. His sons and former crew members have moved into different trades and businesses, carrying with them the same work ethic that made Swamp Loggers so admired. To this day, Swamp Loggers maintains a dedicated following online. Old clips circulate on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, where viewers still trade favorite moments, debate the toughest jobs, and share memories of watching Bobby, Dave, and the crew battle through the mud. What surprises even Bobby is how far the show's reach continues to grow. New generations who were too young to catch the original broadcasts are now discovering it through streaming reruns, drawn to its raw authenticity in a time when reality TV often feels anything but real. Fans often write to Bobby, thanking him for reminding them of their fathers, grandfathers, or small-town roots. Others say the show helped them through hard times, and seeing people work through exhaustion and setbacks gave them the strength to do the same. For the Goodsons, that kind of legacy means more than fame ever could. What do you think of the show's run? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. To enjoy more exciting videos, click play on the video on your screen. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you get notified when a new video drops.